We come now to Romans 12 through 15, where Paul turns from theology to concrete ethical instructions. There are various questions we might ask about this at the outset, such as why is he giving advice to a church he's never visited? And what sort of advice will he issue to a place he doesn't know himself? The advice ranges from the quite general, don't repay evil for evil, think about what's noble, to the surprisingly specific. Some people eat anything. The weak only eat vegetables. Some people judge one day better than another. Others think every day is alike. We'll look in detail at the advice Paul gives, but before embarking on that, we want to step back and ask ourselves, why is Paul giving ethical advice to a church he doesn't know? And why is he introducing it here in the book of Romans? Remember, we want to ask ourselves, how do the various parts of Romans fit together? And how do they fit with Paul's purpose in writing from Corinth to Rome as he begins to travel to Jerusalem and then plans to go on to Spain via the Roman Church? What does giving ethical instruction have to do with that plan? So to recap some of the main sections we've seen in Romans and ask about this section in Romans 12 to 15. Romans 1 to 4 could be put under a heading something like the righteousness of God is from faith to faith, describing how Paul's gospel is consistent with the scriptures, telling a story of first Gentile failure, then Jewish failure, and how God, who had consigned the entire world under unrighteousness, had mercy on all and displayed God's own faithfulness by sending Christ. Romans 5 to 8 seem to tease this out in terms of the power that this unleashed for a life of righteousness. It retells the story of creation beginning with Adam and showing how Christ counteracted all the baleful effects of Adam's transgression for the purpose of addressing a complaint Paul knows is out there, namely that his law-free gospel sounds like it gives license to any sort of behavior. Romans 5 through 8 emphasizes that doesn't make any sense, because the way I'm telling the story, people who were once slaves to sin are now slaves to righteousness. They have a new master. When I say free, I don't mean free to do what they want. I mean free of their nasty old taskmaster, sin, and free to be slaves of God. That whole first section looks like he's explaining his gospel with an eye to some of the criticisms it had elicited. Romans 9 to 11 picks up in a similar vein. If I'm saying God has done something entirely new, Paul says, by giving righteousness to the Gentiles who never even looked for it in the first place, does that mean God has forgotten the promises to Israel? By no means. We come then to this ethical instruction in 12 to 15, and Paul then goes on to recount his travel plans. I'm on my way to Jerusalem with the offering of the nations. I'm then going to go to Spain, and I want to go past Rome in the hopes that you will send me on my way. So what does this treatment of ethical instruction have to do with the grand purpose of Romans? Well, it's important to remember an expression that Paul bookends this entire epistle with. Paul says his purpose as an apostle is to bring about the obedience of faith among all the Gentiles. And he concludes his letter, the penultimate verse, by saying, I am an apostle sent to bring out the obedience of faith. First of all, this is a helpful expression to remind us that when Paul contrasts faith and works, he's contrasting the faith that God manifested in Christ with the works of the law, a particular regimen that God gave to separate Israel from the nations. He's not contrasting faith and doing things. An expression like this gives the lie to that idea. Faith engenders obedience. Obedience and faith go hand in hand. And we can see how ethical instructions are going to give shape to the obedience of faith. That is, Paul needs to say, what does obedient faith look like among the nations? I think that's one reason he gives ethical instructions, is in some ways to give a little glimpse of what is a Pauline Christian life supposed to look like. But we can probably say a bit more. One of the questions I asked is, why does Paul give this advice? The other is, why does he give it here? And that, I think, really is a little confusing, because in some ways you would expect Romans 12 to 15 to follow on Romans 5 to 8. After all, Romans 5 to 8 explains that Paul's gospel does not lead to licentiousness. In fact, it's impossible. That makes no sense. By dying with Christ to the power of sin, people are free to live the same righteousness that Christ has. They have the power of the Spirit now. The law is written on their hearts. So, just as Paul says in 6:13, present yourselves to God, alive from the dead. Present your members as instruments of righteousness. That sounds a lot like how he begins chapter 12. Present your bodies, that's just like present your members, as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. So why doesn't Romans 12 follow right on Romans 8? Why does he pause, as it were, to address the question of God's fidelity to Israel? That may not be a question we can answer perfectly, but I think we can say a few things about why Romans 12 to 15 fit with their context following Romans 9 to 11, God's fidelity to Israel. For one thing, what does it mean for Romans 12 to follow on the heels of this sort of abstract, in some ways, his salvation historical discussion about God and Israel and election and Israel within Israel and God hardening Israel, but it being Israel's fault, and God having a plan to bring the Gentiles in so that all Israel will be saved? That's an interesting discussion, Paul. What does it have to do with don't resist evil and don't try to make your own vengeance and so on and so forth? Be a generous giver, all the things Paul will say in Romans 12. Well, one of the things Paul has in view in Romans 9 to 11 is a story about God's mercy on all. So he includes both Gentiles and Jews in this story, and he says everyone was imprisoned under disobedience so that God could be merciful to all. And Paul opens his ethical instruction by appealing to that mercy, that same mercy. Paul says, in effect, the story I've just told you, this is the reason you present yourselves to God as a living sacrifice. And to use a jargon which has become popular and is, I think, appropriate in Christian theology and preaching and so on, this would be saying there's an indicative and an imperative. There's certain facts about what God has done, and then there's an imperative that follows from that. And Paul says, God has had mercy, he's granted justification, righteousness, therefore carry out that righteousness. I think we can even say more than that. And that is, in Romans 9 to 11, remember now, Paul is writing to Gentiles in this letter. And although mainly his treatment of God's fidelity to Israel is meant to defend God's honor and show that God is a trustworthy God, Paul does pause there toward the end to say, now, Gentiles, you are a wild olive branch. You're an unnatural part of this plant. And God grafted you in. But if God broke off the proper branch, God can certainly break you off. Therefore, don't think you're better than Israel. Don't be haughty, is one of the points Paul brings up in Romans 11. And the very first thing Paul says in Romans 12, that the opening of his exhortation, is he says, renew your minds, be transformed by the renewing of your minds. And he teases out what renewing of the minds primarily means for him. He doesn't mean doing brain exercises and getting smarter. He means giving up one way of thinking and taking on a new way of thinking. The way of thinking that he wants people to get rid of is thinking of yourself more highly than you ought to think. Instead, think with sober judgment. In that sense, Romans 12, especially these opening exhortations, follow quite naturally on Romans 11, where Paul said, one reason I want to tell this story about, from the beginning, God calling Israel, temporary hardening, Gentiles coming in, is so you don't think you're something more special than you are. And this comes up again later in Romans 12. I've given a sort of artificial translation here to bring out resonances in the Greek that could be obscured in the NRSV or in some more elegant translations. When Paul says, be unified, he literally uses this cognate verb with think in it. Think the same thing toward each other. And then he says, don't be arrogant, but literally it is don't think high stuff. Associate with the lowly. And then he says, don't be too wise in your own estimation. That's what the English translations usually say. But again, he's using another word that's related to think. Don't be thinkier than you ought to be. In other words, a major piece of Paul's instruction here in Romans 12 is about attitude. He wants an attitude of unity, an attitude of humility. The core aspect of holiness that Paul teases out in Romans 12, of all the different things he could emphasize, he chooses to dwell on unity and harmony of the group. And that does flow sort of naturally out of Romans 9 to 11, which more than anything say this has everything to do with God's mercy and nothing to do with those who will or who run. We could note a few other ways that this ethical exhortation in Romans 12 has links throughout the sort of grand structure of Romans. So, for instance, in the famous first verse, Paul says, present your bodies as a living sacrifice, a cultic image, that is an image of actual worship, concrete acts of worship. Even the verb present there is a verb that Gentiles, normal Greek speakers, would have recognized as a term used in the cult, that is in pagan cult. It's the word for putting your offering on an altar to burn it. Present your bodies as a living sacrifice. That might have almost sounded shocking. Like, kill ourselves? Go get burnt on the altar? Holy and acceptable to God, which is your rational worship. The NRSV here says spiritual worship. Spiritual is not a bad translation, but I think what it misses is, well, two things. One is spiritual I think in contemporary sort of religious terminology, can sound like it means the opposite of external deeds, like spiritual as opposed to, concrete, doing something, rites and liturgies. But Paul is using liturgical language when he says worship. It's an act of worship. It is liturgy. So I don't think Paul means spiritual as opposed to something that actually happens. What he means is that it pertains to logos, to rationality, to thought. And he means it is rational in a couple of senses. One is that it's a logical response to God's mercy. But the other is that it's a lovely contrast to the sad story about the Gentiles that Paul opened with. The problem with them was what? They had dumb ideas about God, Paul said, and consequently God handed them over to dumb worship. You had a foolish worship of creatures, and now what's one of the blessings of being turned from their ways? They have a rational worship. Finally, a sensible worship that responds to the living God. The other contrast is they were impure and unholy. They used to do stuff they're ashamed of, Paul says in Romans 6. And now they're holy. And this Romans 12 both looks backward toward their old foolish worship, their old impurity, and says, be as holy as the sort of perfect offering that can sit before the holy God. That in turn prepares the way for Paul's travel plans, because what Paul says he's going to Jerusalem with, he's going as a minister of Christ in a priestly service, there's that liturgical language, so that the offering of the Gentiles may be acceptable. He says, present yourselves as an acceptable sacrifice or offering. It's almost as if Paul is saying, my advice to you now, in light of the mercy God's shown you, is please become the sort of acceptable offerings that I can present in Jerusalem when I go. And in that sense, Romans 12 fits rather nicely, following a tale of God's mercy to all peoples and preparing for Paul's trip to Jerusalem, where he needs holy Gentiles in the background if his offering of the Gentiles will be acceptable in Jerusalem. If we look at how Paul urges this modest self-appraisal, we see he opens with a characteristic way of giving his ethical exhortation. Don't be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds. We have all the hallmarks of Paul's eschatological ethics. I would encourage you to review the lecture and the handout I gave on that topic, Paul's eschatological ethics. This is the perfect text to illustrate the way Paul imagines a present evil age that tends to want to shape people like itself by its values and principles. And the heart of sanctification for Paul is instantiating, becoming part of the new creation. Have your minds renewed, be transformed, all this language of shape. At the heart of what bothers him about this world in the present passage is, I think, the characteristic Roman search for honor and the effort to outstrip one another in honor. And Paul is going to say, you know what? You want to be competitive? You want to try to outdo each other? Outdo each other by showing honor, not by hoarding it, not by trying to get it for yourself, to move up the rank of the Roman social scene. So he speaks about an attitude, a new mind. And the new mind, above all, entails an accurate self-assessment. Don't think more highly than you ought to think. Think with sober judgment. What does it mean to judge yourself soberly, accurately? Each of you should judge yourselves according to the measure of faith that God has measured. Now that's a puzzling expression. And it could mean a couple things. I'll mention two possibilities. It could mean something like the measuring stick of faith. That is, the measuring stick that consists of faith. In that case, Paul would mean something like this. The way to have an accurate self-assessment, and not to have this worldly way of assessing yourself, an accurate self-assessment is to measure yourself according to what measuring rod, what measure, what standard? The standard of faith, the standard that consists of faith. And that would probably mean the story of faith, the faith that levels the playing field between Jew and Greek, between all peoples. The faith that Paul's just been talking about, by which God was merciful to those who didn't deserve it. If that's what he means here, it certainly would help buttress his exhortation to judge yourselves soberly. But it's also possible, a straightforward translation would mean something like, judge yourselves according to the amount of faith that got dished out to each of you. That's another way to sort of expand on the measure of faith that God measured. That would seem counterintuitive, because it would seem odd at the same point that Paul says, don't try to judge yourself above another. Why would he appeal to different measures of faith that everyone got? But in this same section, he speaks about the different gifts that people have. And it's at least possible that that's what's going on here. You all got different measures of faith. God filled some people's faith cup a little fuller than he filled other people's faith cup. That's certainly how Paul will talk about faith in Romans 14, where he speaks about the strong in faith and the weak in faith. Regardless of how we render this measure of faith that God has measured, it's clear that Paul is drawing on his own hard-won pastoral wisdom with congregations such as the Corinthian, where when that community has divisions, he urged them to think of themselves as a single body with diverse members. The hand can't say to the foot, I have no need of thee. He doesn't exactly repeat himself, but it looks like he's drawing on that and saying, there's a principle there that I can advise even to you as a congregation I haven't visited. So he notes that there are different gifts, and he then begins to elaborate on those gifts. Not all members have the same function. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us. He begins to name those gifts: if prophecy, if service. One interesting thing is that he will vary the format of this list he gives. I'll say more about that in a moment. But first, I just want to say a word about this expression, in proportion to faith. It looks like his mind is already racing to the idea that different gifts are to be practiced according to different principles. We'll see him develop that in the list as we look at it more fully in a moment. But what does this expression mean, in proportion to faith? Well, it could mean at least two things. It could mean that the gift of prophecy is to be practiced according to the rule of faith. And in fact, this passage, Romans 12:6, is the passage that gives Christendom that expression, the rule of faith. And this would suggest that faith, even for Paul here, means something like fides quae creditur. This is a Latin expression you'll see used to draw a distinction between faith as the content of belief. That's what it would mean if it means the rule of faith here. Alternatively, fides qua creditur, literally the faith by which something is believed. So, two main possibilities. Paul could be saying, if you're using the gift of prophecy, exercise it in accordance with the faith, that is, according to the rule of faith. What you say in charismatic utterance needs to be consistent with the faith we hold. Or, if he means fides qua creditur, that is the faith by which you believe, it could mean something more like inspired preaching is to be engaged within the limits of the gift. That is, you can't add any of your own material. You only prophesy so far as faith guides you. In any event, as we move along in this list, we'll see that Paul, a couple times, sort of breaks his symmetry and starts building on a new pattern. So first, he gives examples of gifts. Prophecy is a gift. Service is a gift. Then he starts to name offices, or in fact, just grammatically speaking, he names people. If someone's a teacher, let them do it in teaching. If someone's an exhorter, let them do it in exhorting. You'll notice all these words in yellow, he's used cognate words. That is, teacher is related etymologically to teaching, exhorter to exhortation. Then he continues with using the definite article, and these descriptions of what people do, but he breaks the pattern of using cognates. So he doesn't say the sharer in sharing, he says the sharer in simplicity or generosity, the one presiding in diligence, the one showing mercy in cheerfulness. You can see when you get to categories like the one showing mercy or the sharer, Paul's not talking about carefully defined offices, that is, church offices. Like there are deacons, and there are apostles, and there are prophets, and there are teachers. It's not very long in the origins of Christianity before distinct offices are developed, with rules for those offices and different guidelines for how those offices are to be exercised. But Paul is speaking here about broadly defined gifts. Obviously, someone who prophesies might also someday show mercy. And the person who is a sharer is presumably also someone who might teach. I just want to say one more word about the list, because I'm curious, and I think many people have been curious. Why does Paul name these things and not others? And there's no perfectly good answer, but one other term here that could be translated a couple different ways is this word presiding, the one presiding. That participle could also be rendered the one who gives aid. But it's related, it's cognate with the word he'll use in Romans 16 when he talks about Phoebe being a presider of the congregation. And in other passages, both in Paul's letters and in Jewish texts about leaders of the synagogue, this is a word for someone who is in a position of authority. All right, moving along. Broad picture, what's Paul talking about? Folks, I want you to be unified. Don't have a worldly attitude. Have a unified attitude. One way to have that attitude is to recognize that there's one body, even though everyone's different. These are gifts. It's an important term because it means they come from God, not to be used to distinguish one person from another. He continues in this vein. And now it looks again like he's no longer naming different categories of gift. It looks more here like we're into general sort of gnomic exhortation. And he's just giving a list of things he wants the community to be characterized by. Brotherly love. When it comes to brotherly love, care deeply for each other. When it comes to honor, consider each other better. I just have to say a word about that because, again, here's the real countercultural note. When it comes to honor, don't strive for honor. He's paradoxical here. When it comes to honor, outdo each other. But so he appeals to this idea of the struggle to have the most honor, and he flips it on its head. Yeah, you want to have a contest about honor, like everyone in the Roman Empire is excited about in the first century? Have a contest about giving honor. That's what Paul says here. In diligence, don't be sluggish. In the spirit, be boiling. To the Lord be serving. In hope, be rejoicing. In affliction, enduring. In prayer, persevering. The needs of the saints sharing. Love for aliens pursuing. These sound fairly general. He continues with the note of unity. And here, we have one of the rare instances where Paul gives a piece of advice that sounds like it comes from the Jesus tradition. It sounds like it's something Jesus taught. If we step back from this advice Paul gives here in Romans 12 to 15, it's worth asking, where does he get this? And in what sense is his moral exhortation Christian? How is it distinctively Christ-focused? Well, in this case, bless those who persecute you certainly is somewhat related to Matthew 5:44, similar saying that appears in Luke, where Jesus says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. Paul says, bless them, not pray for them. Now, we might ask if Paul has captured the moral logic that Jesus gives. Jesus insists, pray for those who persecute you so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For God makes the sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. In other words, Jesus' point in Matthew is, God loves everyone. If you want to imitate your Father, you also love those people, even the wicked, even those who persecute you. We'll see in just a moment, Paul seems to have a slightly different rationale for why you show kindness in the face of evil. Before we get there, some interesting words of advice, perhaps easily lost. Rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Paul does not insist, for all the times he says Christians should rejoice in the Lord, again I say rejoice, he has no problem with the place of sadness in the spirit-filled life. In fact, the appropriate reaction to those who are mourning is to mourn with them, he says. Interesting point. Live in harmony, associate with the lowly, don't claim to be wiser than you are. Paul goes on to develop this idea of non-retaliation, and he does so with two Old Testament passages. Don't repay anyone evil for evil. A bit like Jesus saying in Matthew 5:39, don't resist evil, or don't resist an evil one. Paul says, take care for what is noble in the sight of all. So far as it depends on you, be in peace with everyone. Don't avenge yourselves. Leave room for the wrath of God, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. Deuteronomy 32:35. And then Paul fleshes it out, and he doesn't say, Don't resist evil, pray for those who persecute you, because in so doing you imitate your Father in heaven, who loves everyone. Here Paul says, if your enemies are hungry, feed them. If they're thirsty, give them something to drink, for by doing this you heap burning coals on their heads. This sounds like a different piece of logic. Now, one possibility is that this is to somehow elicit repentance in them, but the fact that Paul has just appealed to God's vengeance seems to mean that the reason you don't avenge yourselves is because God will do the avenging. The reason you're kind to your enemies is that in so doing, if anything, you just provoke God to action. Do not be overcome by evil, overcome evil with good. Paul's instruction here to leave vengeance to God seems to be the hook that leads to the next chapter. Because he says, leave room for the wrath of God. God declares, vengeance is mine, I will repay. Well, what does the next section of Romans take up? God will repay. And in fact, Romans 13, 1-7 fleshes out how. By means of God's servant, the Roman Empire. The very terminology used here about the wrath of God is what Paul picks up in the next paragraph. The state, the authorities, are the servant of God to execute God's wrath on bad behavior. Why can you forego avenging yourselves? Because Rome will take care of it. That's a remarkable claim, and one we will look at in the subsequent lecture.